Hello! Happy Thursday? Yes, it's Thursday now. And welcome to Quarantine Storytime. I'm Charlotte, and we're reading War and Peace. Still. Slowly making our way through it, as you can see from the photo. We have made it into, still in volume 1, but part 2. We'll try to read section 8, 9, and 10 today. Hey! Hi to everyone who's on and on the live chat. Feel free to say something. I'll give you a shout out. My mom's here, the most active participant of my live chat. Thanks, Mom. Keeping me on my toes, keeping it interesting. She's very helpful. She's my researcher, so she follows the different claims that I make and follows them up with even more interesting factoids. So thanks, Mom, for doing all the heavy lifting for me. Unfortunately, she can't do the heavy lifting of getting through all of the foreign languages that have been included in this book, the Russian, French, German, Italian. So my apologies for that. Hopefully I will sound very polylingual by the time I'm done with this, just for being familiar with all these different readings. So we're in the war section of War and Peace now, and it looks like we're heading towards a battle with some of our well-known characters. Prince Andrei, we've got the young son of Count Rostov, the young Count Nikolai Rostov, and looks like even though they're in different squadrons, as you say, different even maybe branches or whatever, looks like their two different groups are coming together for this battle for Bonaparte, as a reminder. And as I said at the end of my last video, some of the characters have interesting ways their dialogue is written out. So Count Rostov's commander is a Denisov, and everything he says has an extra GH in it. So I guess it's supposed to sound kind of gruff and guttural, but for me, I think it starts coming out like a weird German accent. So my apologies if my interpretation is not how you would have heard it in your brain when you're reading it. But it's kind of a fun device that Tolstoy uses. So if you are here for the first time, welcome. And if you're coming back, welcome to you as well. If you missed anything, there's the War and Peace playlist on my channel that has all of the readings, and this will go in that playlist. This reading today will go in the playlist after we're done. So feel free to jump around, reread anything that makes sense, and like I said, say hi or drop questions in the live chat. It's always nice to see who's here and who's if you have any questions or comments about what's going on. So I can't really see who's live. I just see that there are people watching live, so that's fun. But if you say something in the chat, hopefully that'll give me an indication of who you are. And thank you to the people friends and new friends who have subscribed to the channel. That's really great. It's just nice to know that other people are appreciating this as well. Something different to take your mind off of what's going on right now. There's been struggles throughout history, and sometimes taking your mind off our present struggle gives a little bit more perspective. And so we'll jump into the eternal struggle of classic literature and multilingual people for us people who are not quite as learned. Anyways, so section 8. The rest of the infantry hurriedly crossed the bridge, squeezing into a funnel at the entrance. Finally, all the carts were passed over, the crush eased up, and the last battalion entered the bridge. Only the hussars of Denisov's squadron remained on the other side of the bridge, facing the enemy. The enemy, visible in the distance from the opposite hill, were not yet visible from the bridge below, because, from the bottom where the river flowed, the horizon was bounded by the opposite heights less than half a mile away. Ahead was a deserted space over which clusters of our Cossack patrols moved here and there. Suddenly on the road, going up the opposite heights, appeared the troops in blue coats and artillery. It was the French. A Cossack patrol moved down the hill at a trot. All of the officers and men of Denisov's squadron, though they tried to talk about unrelated things and look elsewhere, constantly thought only about what was there on the hill, and kept peering at the spots that appeared on the horizon, which they recognized as enemy troops. After midday, the weather cleared again. The sun shone brightly, going down over the Danube and the dark hills around it. It was still, and once in a while from the hill floated the sounds of the bugles and the shouts of the enemy. Between the squadron and the enemy there were now nothing but some small patrols. They were separated by an empty space of about 600 yards. The enemy stopped shooting, and that distinct, menacing, inaccessible, and elusive line that separates two enemy armies became all the more clearly felt. One step beyond that line, reminiscent of the line separating the living from the dead, and it's the unknown, suffering and death. What is there? Who is there? There beyond this field and the tree and the roof lit by the sun? No one knows, and you would like to know, and you're afraid to cross the line, and you would like to cross it, and you know that sooner or later you will have to cross it and find out what is there on the other side of the line, as you will inevitably find out what is there on the other side of death. And you're strong, healthy, cheerful, and excited, and surrounded by people just as strong and excitedly animated. So if he does not think it, every man feels who finds himself within sight of an enemy. And this feeling gives a particular brilliance and joyful sharpness of impression to everything that happens in those moments. On a knoll occupied by the enemy, the smoke of a shot appeared, and a cannonball flew whistling over the heads of the hussar squadron. The officers, who were standing together, rode to their posts. The hussars assiduously began lining up their horses. Everything became hushed in the squadron. Everyone kept looking ahead at the enemy and the squadron commander, awaiting a command. Another cannonball flew over, then a third. Obviously, the shots were aimed at the hussars, but the cannonballs, with a rapid, steady whistling, kept flying over the hussars' heads and hitting somewhere behind them. The hussars did not look back, but with each sound of a flying cannonball, the whole squadron, as if on command, with all their similarly dissimilar faces, holding their breath while the cannonball flew over, rose in their stirrups, then lowered themselves down again. Without turning their heads, the soldiers looked sideways at one another, curious to spy out a comrade's impressions. On each face, from Denisov down to the buglers, there appeared around the lips and chin a common trait of a struggle between irritation and excitement. The sergeant major frowned, looking the soldiers over as if threatening them with punishment. Junker Mironov ducked down each time a cannonball flew by. Rostov, standing on the left flank, on his slightly lame but imposing little rook, had the happy air of a schoolboy called up before a large public at an examination in which he is sure he will distinguish himself. He looked around at them all serenely and brightly, as if asking them to pay attention to how calmly he stood under fire. But on his face, too, that same trait of something new and stern appeared, against his will, around the mouth. "Who's that bowing there?" "Junker Mironov! Not right, look at me!" shouted Denisov, who could not stay still and fidgeted on his horse in front of the squadron. Vaska Denisov's pug-nosed and black-haired face, and his whole small, compact figure with his sinewy hand, the short fingers covered with hair, in which he gripped the hilt of his bared saber, was the same as ever, especially towards evening, after drinking a couple of bottles. Only he was more red than usual, and throwing his shaggy head back the way birds do when they drink, and mercilessly digging the spurs of his small feet into the sides of the good Bedouin, he galloped off, as if falling backwards, to the other flank of the squadron, and shouted in a hoarse voice that they should inspect their pistols. He rode up to Kirsten, the staff captain, on his broad and sedate mare, rode slowly to meet Denisov. The staff captain, with his long mustache, was as serious as ever, only his eyes shone more than usual. "Well, what?" he said, Denisov. "It won't come to a fight. You'll see. We'll withdraw." "Devil knows what we're up to," Denisov grumbled. "Ah, Rostov," he cried to the junker, noticing his cheerful face. "Well, you're done waiting." He smiled approvingly, obviously glad for the junker. Rostov felt himself perfectly happy. Just then the commander appeared on the bridge. Denisov galloped towards him. "Your Excellency, allow us to attack. I'll crush them." "Attack indeed," the colonel said in a bored voice, wincing as if a fly was pestering him. "And why are you standing here? You can see the flanks are retreating. Bring the squadron back across." The squadron crossed the bridge and moved out of the range of fire without losing a single man. After them, the second squadron, forming a line, also crossed, and the last Cossacks cleared off from that side. Having crossed the bridge, the two squadrons of the Pavlogradsky hussars went back up the hill one after the other. The regimental commander, Karl Bogdanovich Schubert, rode over to Denisov's squadron and fell in step with them not far from Rostov, paying no attention to him, though this was the first time they had seen each other since their confrontation over Telyanin. Rostov, feeling himself at the front and in the power of a man before whom he now considered himself guilty, fixed his eyes on the athletic back, blond nape, and red neck of the regimental commander. At first it seemed to Rostov that Bogdanich was only pretending to be inattentive, and that his whole goal now consisted in testing the Junker's courage. And he sat up straight and looked around cheerfully. Then it seemed to him that Bogdanich was deliberately riding close to him in order to show Rostov his own courage. Then he thought that his enemy would now deliberately send the squadron into a desperate attack in order to punish him, Rostov. Then he thought that, after the attack, he would come to him as he lay wounded and magnanimously offer him a conciliatory hand. Zherkov, with his shoulders raised high, a familiar figure to the Pavlogradsky hussars, he had recently quit their regiment, rode up to the regimental commander. After his expulsion from the head staff, Zherkov had not remained with the regiment, saying that he was no fool to drudge away at the front when he could go get more decorations while doing nothing on the staff. And he had managed to set himself up as an orderly officer for Prince Bagration. He came to his former superior with an order from the commander of the rear guard. "Colonel," he said with his gloomy earnestness, addressing Rostov's enemy and looking around at his comrades, "there is an order to stop and set fire to the bridge." "An order of who?" the colonel asked sullenly. "I don't know of who, Colonel," the cornet replied earnestly. "Only the prince told me, go and tell the colonel that the hussars must turn back quickly and set fire to the bridge." After Zherkov, the officer of the suite rode up to the hussar colonel with the same order. After the officer of the suite, on a Cossack horse that was barely able to gallop under him, fat Nowitzki rode up. "What is this, Colonel?" he cried while still riding. "I told you to set fire to the bridge, and somebody got it wrong. Everybody's going crazy there. They can't figure it out." The colonel unhurriedly halted his regiment and turned to Nowitzki. "You spoke to me about flammable material," he said, "but you said nothing to me about setting fire to it." "What do you mean, my dear man?" Nowitzki said, stopping, taking off his cap and smoothing his sweat-dampened hair with a plump hand. "What do you mean I didn't tell you to set fire to the bridge, since you put flammable material there? I am not dear man to you, Mr. Staff Officer, and you did not tell me to set fire to the bridge. I know the surface, and I am habituated to strictly fulfill orders. You said that the bridge was to be set on fire, but who would set it on fire I cannot say by the Holy Spirit." "It's always like that," Nowitzki said, waving his hand. "What are you doing here?" He turned to Zherkov. "The same as you. You're soaking wet, though. Let me wring you out." "You said, Master Staff Officer," the colonel went on in an offended tone. "Colonel," the officer of the suite interrupted, "you must hurry, otherwise the enemy will move up his canister guns." The colonel looked silently at the officer of the suite, at the fat staff officer, at Zherkov, and frowned. "I will set fire to the bridge," he said in a solemn tone, as if to show that, despite all the unpleasantness done to him, he would still do what he had to do. Striking his horse with his long, muscular legs, as if it was all the horse's fault, the colonel moved forward and commanded the second squadron, the one in which Rostov served under Denisov, to go back to the bridge. "Well, that's it," thought Rostov. "He wants to test me." His heart contracted and blood flushed to his face. "Let him see whether I'm a coward," he thought. Again there appeared on all the cheerful faces of the men of the squadron that serious trait that had been there when they were under fire. Rostov, never taking his eyes away, kept looking at his enemy, the regimental commander, wishing to find on his face a confirmation of his surmises. But the colonel never once glanced at Rostov, but as always at the front, looking stern and solemn. The command was heard. Step lively, several voices said near him. Their sabers catching in their bridles, their spurs jingling, the hussars hurriedly dismounted, not knowing themselves what they were going to do. The hussars crossed themselves. Rostov no longer looked at the regimental commander. He had no time. He was afraid. With a sinking heart, he was afraid to lag behind the hussars. His hand shook as he turned his horse over to the handler, and he felt the blood throbbing as it rose to his heart. Denisov, lurching backwards and shouting something, rode past him. Rostov saw nothing but the hussars running around him, their spurs catching and their sabers clanking. "Stretcher!" someone's voice shouted behind. Rostov did not think of what the call for a stretcher meant. He ran on, trying only to be ahead of everyone else, but just by the bridge, not looking under his feet, he got into the slimy, trampled mud, stumbled, and fell on his hands. Others ran past him. "On both sides, Captain," he heard the voice of the regimental commander, who, having ridden ahead, stood mounted near the bridge with a triumphant and merry face. Rostov, wiping his muddy hands on his breeches, looked at his enemy and wanted to run further, supposing that the further ahead he got, the better it would be. But Bogdanich, though he neither looked at nor recognized Rostov, shouted at him, "Who's that running in the middle of the bridge? Keep to the right! Back, Junker!" he cried out angrily, and turned to Denisov, who, flaunting his courage, rode out onto the planks of the bridge. "Vy riskiert, Captain, better dismount," said the colonel. I'll find out what the one it's meant for," replied Denisov, turning on his saddle. Meanwhile, Novitzky, Zherkov, and the officer of the suite stood together out of range of the fire and looked at this small bunch of men in yellow shakovs, dark green jackets embroidered with cord, and blue breeches, pottering about by the bridge, and on the other side, at blue coats and groups of horses, which could easily be identified as artillery, approaching in the distance. "Will they set it to fire, or won't they? Who'll be first? Will they run and set fire to the bridge, or will the French come within canister shot range and kill them all?" These questions were involuntarily asked with sinking heart by each man of that large mass of troops which stood above the bridge and in the bright evening light looked at the bridge and the hussars, and on the other side at the advancing bluecoats with bayonets and guns. "Ah, the hussars are going to get it," said Novitzky. "It's close enough for the canister shot now." "He shouldn't have taken so many men," said the officer of the suite. "Indeed not," said Novitzky. "If he'd sent 2 brave lads, it would be the same." "Ah, Your Excellency," Zherkov mixed in, not taking his eyes from the hussars, but still with his naive manner, which made it impossible to tell whether he's speaking seriously or not. "Ah, Your Excellency, what a way to reason! Send 2 men, and who's going to give us a Vladimir with a bow? This way they may get beaten, but the squadron will be distinguished, and he'll get a bow. Our Bogdanich knows the system." "Well," said the officer of the suite, "there's the canisters." He pointed to the French guns, which were being taken from their limbers and hurriedly deployed. On the French side, among the groups where the guns were, a puff of smoke appeared, a second, a third, almost simultaneously, and just as the sound of the first shot reached them, a fourth appeared. 2 sounds, one after another, and a third. "Oh, oh!" gasped Novitzky, as if from burning pain, seizing the officer of the suite by the arm. "Look, he's fallen! One of them has fallen! 2 of them, I believe. If I were the Tsar, I'd never go to war," Novitzky said, turning away. The French guns were being hurriedly reloaded. The infantry in blue coats moved towards the bridge at a run. Again, puffs of smoke appeared at various intervals, and the canister shot went crackling and rattling over the bridge. But this time, Novitzky could not see what was happening on the bridge. Thick smoke rose from it. The hussars had managed to set fire to the bridge, and the French batteries were now shooting not in order to hinder them, but because the guns had been aimed and there were people to shoot at. The French managed to fire 3 rounds of canister shot before the hussars got back to the horse tenders. 2 of the rounds were poorly aimed, and all the shots went overhead. But the last round landed in the middle of a bunch of hussars and brought down 3 of them. Rostov, preoccupied with his relations with Bogdanich, stopped on the bridge, not knowing what to do with himself. There was no one to cut down, as he had always pictured battle to himself, nor could he help set fire to the bridge because, unlike the other soldiers, he had not brought a plate of straw with him. He was standing and looking about when suddenly there was a rattling on the bridge, as if someone had spilled nuts, and one of the hussars, the one nearest him, fell on the railing with a groan. Rostov ran to him with the others. Again, someone cried, "Stretcher!" 4 men took hold of the hussar and began to lift him up. "Oh, leave me alone, for Christ's sake," the wounded man cried, but all the same they lifted him up and laid him on the stretcher. Nikolai Rostov turned away as if searching for something, began looking at the distance, at the waters of the Danube, at the sky, at the sun. How good the sky seemed, how blue, calm, and deep. How bright and solemn the setting sun, how tenderly and lustrously glistened the waters of the distant Danube. And better still were the distant blue hills beyond the Danube, the convent, the mysterious gorges, the pine forests bathed in mists to their tops. There was peace, happiness. "There's nothing I would wish for. There's nothing I would wish for if only I were there," thought Rostov, In me alone and in this sun there is so much happiness, but here, groans and suffering, fear, and this obscurity, this hurry. Again, they're shouting something, and again, everybody's run back somewhere, and I'm running with them, and here it is, death above me, around me. An instant, and I'll never again see this sun, this water, this gorge. Just then the sun began to hide itself behind the clouds. Ahead of Rostov another stretcher appeared, and his fear of death and the stretcher and his love of the sun and life all merged into one painfully disturbing impression. Lord God, the one there in this sky, save, forgive, and protect me, Rostov whispered to himself. The hussars ran up to the handlers. The voices became louder and calmer. The stretchers disappeared from sight. What brother got a whiff of powder? Denisov's voice shouted by his ear. It's all over, but I'm a coward. Yes, I'm a coward, thought Rostov, and sighing deeply, he took his lame little rook from the handler and began to mount. What was it, a canister shot? He asked Denisov. And then some, shouted Denisov. Good work, lads, and it was a rotten job. Attacking is a lovely thing. Cut him to pieces, but here, devil knows it's more like target practice. And Denisov rode off to a group that had stopped not far from Rostov, the regimental commander, Nevitsky, Zherkov, and the officer of the suite. However, it seems no one noticed, Rostov thought to himself, and indeed no one had noticed anything, because they were all familiar with the feeling a junker experiences when he is under fire for the first time. There'll be a report in it for you, said Zherkov. Just see if I don't get promoted sub-lieutenant. Inform the prince that if I have set foot to the bridge, the colonel said triumphantly and cheerfully. And what if he asks about the losses? Trifles, the colonel boomed. 2 hussars wounded and 1 killed on the spot, he said with obvious joy, unable to hold back a happy smile, sonorously rapping out the beautiful phrase, killed on the spot. Section 9. Pursued by the 100,000 men French army under the leadership of Bonaparte, encountering a hostile local populace, and no longer trusting their allies, suffering from a shortness of supplies and forced to act outside all foreseeable conditions of war, the 35,000-man Russian army, under the leadership of Kutuzov, hastily retreated down the Danube, stopping whenever the enemy caught up with it, and fighting rearguard actions, only insofar as it was necessary in order to retreat without loss of heavy equipment. There was action in Lambach, Amstetten, and Molk, but despite the courage and steadfastness acknowledged by the enemy themselves, with which the Russians fought, the result of these actions was only a still speedier retreat. The Austrian troops that had escaped capture at Ulm and joined Kutuzov at Braunau now separated from the Russian army, and Kutuzov was left with nothing but his own weak, exhausted forces. To defend Vienna was no longer thinkable. Instead of the offensive war, profoundly thought out according to the laws of the new science of strategy, the plan of which had been given to Kutuzov while in Vienna by the Austrian Hofkriegsrath, the sole and almost unattainable goal now remaining for Kutuzov was to unite with the troops coming from Russia without losing his own army, as Mack had done at Ulm. On the 28th of October, Kutuzov crossed with his army to the left bank of the Danube and halted for the first time, having put the Danube between himself and the main forces of the French. On the 30th, he attacked Mortier's division, which was on the left bank of the Danube, and crushed it. In this action, trophies were taken for the first time, a banner, a cannon, and 2 enemy generals. For the first time, after a 2-week retreat, the Russian troops halted, and after the fighting not only held the field of battle, but drove the French away. Despite the fact that the troops were ill-clad, worn out, weakened by a third with the stragglers, the wounded, the dead, and the sick, despite the fact that the sick and the wounded had been left on the other side of the Danube with a letter from Kutuzov entrusting them to the humaneness of the enemy, despite the fact that the big hospitals and houses in Krems that had been turned into infirmaries could no longer accommodate all the sick and wounded, despite all that, the halt at Krems and the victory over the Mortier raised the spirits of the troops significantly. Throughout the army and in the headquarters, joyful, though incorrect, rumors were rife about the imaginary approach of the columns from Russia, about some victory won by the Austrians, and about the retreat of the frightened Bonaparte. At the time of the battle, Prince Andrei was attached to the Austrian general Schmidt, killed in that action. His horse had been shot from under him, and his arm had been slightly grazed by a bullet. As a sign of special favor, the commander-in-chief had sent him with news of the victory to the Austrian Court, no longer in Vienna, which was threatened by the French, but in Brünn. On the night of the battle, Prince Andrei, agitated but not tired, despite his apparently slight build, Prince Andrei could endure physical fatigue far better than the strongest people. Having come back on horseback with a message from Doktorov to Kutuzov and Krems, was sent that same night as a courier to Brünn. Being sent as a courier, apart from its rewards, also signified an important step towards promotion. The night was dark, starry. The road lay black amidst the white snow that had fallen that day, the day of the battle. Now going over his impressions of the past battle, now joyfully imagining the impression he would make with his news of the victory, recalling his leave-taking from the commander-in-chief and his comrades, Prince Andrei galloped along in a post-britska, experiencing the feeling of a man who had long been awaiting and finally achieved the beginning of the happiness he desired. As soon as he closed his eyes, the firing of muskets and cannon resounded in his ears, merging with the rattle of the carriage and the impression of the victory. Now he would begin to imagine that the Russians were fleeing, that he himself had been killed, but then he would hurriedly wake up and happily learn, as if for the first time, that none of it had happened, and that, on the contrary, the French had fled. He would recall once more all the details of the victory, his calm manliness during the battle, and reassured would doze off. After this dark, starry night came a bright, cheerful morning. The snow melted in the sun. The horses galloped swiftly, and to the right and left alike, past new and various forests, fields, and villages. At one of the posting stations, he overtook a convoy carrying Russian wounded. The Russian officer who was leading the transport sprawled in the front cart, shouting something, abusing a soldier in rude terms. 6 or more pale, bandaged, and dirty wounded went jolting down the road in each of the long German Vorspanns. Some of them were talking. He heard Russian speech. Others were eating bread. The most seriously wounded gazed at the courier, galloping past them silently, with a meek and sickly childish interest. Prince Andrei ordered the driver to stop and asked the soldiers what action they had been wounded in. 2 days ago on the Danube, a soldier replied. Prince Andrei took out a purse and gave the soldier 3 gold pieces. For all of you, he added, addressing the approaching officer. Get well, lads, he added to the soldiers. There's still a lot to be done. Well, Mr. Adjutant, what's the news? Asked the officer, obviously wishing to strike up a conversation. Good news! Drive on! He cried to the coachman and galloped on his way. It was already quite dark when Prince Andrei drove into Brünn and saw himself surrounded by tall buildings, lighted shops, windows, street lamps, fine carriages noisily driving over the pavement, and all the atmosphere of a big, lively town, which is always so attractive for a military man after camp life. Prince Andrei, despite the quick driving and the sleepless night, felt himself still more animated than the day before as he pulled up to the palace. Only his eyes shone with a feverish gleam, and his thoughts followed one another with extraordinary speed and clarity. He vividly pictured again all the details of the battle, not vaguely now, but in the well-defined, concise account which, in his imagination, he was giving to the Emperor Franz. He vividly pictured the casual conversation that might be put to him and the answers he would give to them. He supposed that he would be presented to the emperor at once, but at the main entrance of the palace, an official came running out to him, and recognizing that he was a courier, led him to another entrance. To the right from the corridor here, Ihr Hochgebogen, you will find the Emperor Adjutant on duty. The Imperial Adjutant on duty, said the officer. He will take you to the Minister of War. The Imperial Adjutant on duty, meeting Prince Andrei, asked him to wait and went to the Minister of War. 5 minutes later, the Imperial Adjutant returned, and inclining with particular courtesy and letting Prince Andrei go ahead of him, led him down the corridor to the office where the Minister of War worked. The Imperial Adjutant seemed to want to protect himself from any attempts at familiarity with the Russian adjutant. Prince Andrei's joyful feeling weakened significantly as he approached the doors of the Minister of War's office. He felt offended, and the feeling of offense turned that same instant, without his noticing it, into a feeling of totally groundless scorn. His resourceful mind suggested to him that the same instant the point of view from which he had the right to scorn both the adjutant and the Minister of War. To him it must seem very easy to win a victory, having never had a whiff of powder, he thought. His eyes narrowed scornfully. He entered the Minister of War's office especially slowly. This feeling increased still more when he saw the Minister of War sitting at the big desk and for the first 2 minutes paying no attention to the one who had entered. The Minister of War had lowered his bald head with gray temples between 2 wax candles and was reading some papers, making notes with a pencil. He went on reading to the end without raising his head when the door opened and footsteps were heard. "Take this and deliver it," the Minister of War said to his adjutant, handing him the papers and still paying no attention to the courier. Prince Andrei felt that either of all the matters that had occupied the Minister of War, the actions of Kutuzov's army must interest him the least, or that he had to give the Russian courier that feeling. But it's all quite the same to me, he thought. The Minister of War put the rest of the papers together, stacked them evenly, and raised his head. He had an intelligent and characteristic head, but the moment he turned to Prince Andrei, the intelligent and firm expression on the Minister of War's face changed. Evidently habitually and consciously, there remained on his face the stupid, feigned smile, which did not conceal its feigning, of a man who receives many petitioners one after the other. "From General Field Marshal Kutuzov," he asked. "With good news, I hope? There was an encounter with Mortier. A victory? About time." He took the dispatch, which was addressed to him, and began reading it with a sorrowful expression. "Ah, my God, Schmidt," he said in German. "What a misfortune, what a misfortune." Having looked through the dispatch, he put it on the table and glanced at Prince Andrei, clearly weighing something. "Ah, what a misfortune. You say it was a decisive action? Mortier wasn't taken, however," he reflected. "I'm very, very glad you've come with the news, though Schmidt's death is a high price for a victory. His Majesty will certainly wish to see you, but not today. Thank you, get some rest, but be at the levee tomorrow after the parade. I'll let you know, however." The stupid smile that had disappeared during the conversation reappeared on the Minister of War's face. "Goodbye, thank you very much. The sovereign will probably wish to see you," he repeated, and then inclined his head. When Prince Andrei left the palace, he felt that all the interest and happiness afforded to him by the victory had now left him and had been given over into the indifferent hands of the Minister of War and the courteous adjutant. His whole way of thinking changed instantly. The battle appeared to him now as a long-past, far-off memory. Section 10. Prince Andrei stayed in Brünn with his acquaintance, the Russian diplomat Bilibin. "Ah, dear Prince, there's no guest more welcome," said Bilibin, coming out to meet Prince Andrei. "Franz, take the prince's things to my bedroom." He turned to the servant who had accompanied Volokhonsky. "What, are you a herald of victory? Excellent! I'm sitting here sick, as you see." Prince Andrei, having washed and dressed, came out to the diplomat's luxurious study and sat down to the prepared dinner. Bilibin settled comfortably by the fireplace. Not only after his trip, but after the whole campaign, during which he had been deprived of all the comforts of cleanliness and the refinements of life, Prince Andrei experienced the pleasant feeling of repose amidst the luxurious conditions of life to which he had been accustomed since childhood. Besides, it was pleasant for him, after his Austrian reception, to speak, if not Russian, they spoke French, at least with a Russian man, who he supposed shared the general Russian aversion, now almost especially sharply felt, to the Austrians. Bilibin was a man of about 35, a bachelor, of the same society as Prince Andrei. They had been acquainted back in Petersburg, but had become more closely acquainted during Prince Andrei's visit to Vienna with Kutuzov. As Prince Andrei was a young man who promised to go far in his military career, so, and still more, was Bilibin promising in the diplomacy. He was still a young man, but no longer a young diplomat, since he had begun to serve at the age of 16, had been in Paris and Copenhagen, and now occupied a rather important post in Vienna. Both the Chancellor and our ambassador in Vienna knew him and valued him. He did not belong to that large number of diplomats whose duty it is to have only negative merits, to not do certain things and to speak French so as to be very good diplomats. He was one of those diplomats who like and know how to work, and despite his laziness, he occasionally spent nights at his desk. He worked equally well whatever the essence of the work consisted of. He was interested not in the question of why, but in the question of how. What the diplomatic business consisted of made no difference to him, but to compose a circular, a memorandum, report artfully, aptly, and elegantly, and that he took great pleasure. Bilibin's merits were valued, apart from his written work, also for his skill of moving and speaking in the higher spheres. Bilibin liked conversation just as he liked work, and only when the conversation could be elegantly witty. Bilibin liked conversation just as he liked work, only when the conversation could be elegantly witty. In society, he consistently waited for the opportunity to say something remarkable and enter into conversation not otherwise than on that condition. Bilibin's conversation was constantly sprinkled with wittily original and well-turned phrases of general interest. These phrases were manufactured in Bilibin's inner laboratory, as if intentionally of a portable nature, so that society nonentities could readily remember them and pass them on from drawing room to drawing room, as indeed les monts de Bilibin se colportent dans les salons de Vienne, as they say, or Bilibin's sayings were peddled in the drawing rooms of Vienna, and often had an influence on the so-called important affairs. His thin, drawn, yellowish face was all covered with deep wrinkles, which always looked as neatly and as thoroughly washed as one's fingertips after a bath. The movement of these wrinkles constituted the main play of his physiognomy. Now his forehead would wrinkle into wide folds as his eyebrows rose, then his eyebrows would descend and deep wrinkles would form on his cheeks. His small, deep-set eyes always looked out directly and merrily. "Well, now, tell me about your exploits," he said. In a most modest way, not once mentioning himself, Volokhonsky told about the action and his reception by the Minister of War. "Ils m'ont reçu avec ma nouvelle comme un chien dans un jeu de quilles," he concluded. Bilibin smiled and released the folds of his skin. "Cependant, mon cher," he said, studying his fingernails from a distance and gathering up the skin over his left eye, "malgré la haute estime que je professe pour les orthodoxes Russians en forces, j'avoue que votre victoire n'est pas de plus victorieuse." He went on in the same way, in French, pronouncing in Russian only those words he wanted to underscore contemptuously. "How then, with all your mass, you fell upon the unfortunate Mortier with his one division, and this Mortier slips between your fingers. Where's the victory?" "All the same, seriously speaking," replied Prince Andrei, "we can still say without boasting that this is a bit better than Ulm." "Why didn't you capture us at least one marshal?" "Because not everything goes as it's supposed to, and with such regularity as on parade. We planned, as I told you, to attack their rear by 7 in the morning, but we didn't even get there by 5 in the afternoon." "And why didn't you get there at 7 in the morning?" "You had to get there at 7 in the morning," Bilibin said, smiling. "You had to get there at 7 in the morning. And why didn't you convince Bonaparte through diplomatic channels that he'd better leave Genoa?" Prince Andrei said in the same tone. "I know," Bilibin interrupted. "You think it's very easy to capture marshals while sitting on a sofa in front of a fireplace." "That's true, but even so, why didn't you capture him? And don't be surprised if not only the Minister of War, but the most august Emperor and King Franz is not made very happy by your victory. Nor do I, a miserable secretary of the Russian embassy, feel any particular joy." He looked straight at Prince Andrei and suddenly relaxed all the skin gathered on his forehead. "Now it's my turn to ask you why, my dear," said Volokhonsky. "I confess to you that I don't understand. Maybe there are diplomatic subtleties here that are beyond my feeble mind, but I don't understand. Mack loses a whole army, the Archduke Ferdinand and the Archduke Karl give no signs of life and make blunder after blunder. Kutuzov alone finally gains a real victory, destroys the charm of the French, and the Minister of War isn't even interested in learning the details." "Precisely for that reason, my dear. Voyez-vous, mon cher, hurrah for the Tsar, for Russ, for the faith. Tout ça est bel et bon. But what do we, the Austrian Court, care about your victories? Bring us some nice little news about a victory of the Archduke Karl or Ferdinand. Un archduc vote l'autre, as you say. even over a fire brigade of Bonaparte's, and that will be a different story. We'll shoot off all our cannons, whereas this, as if on purpose, can only exasperate us. The Archduke Karl does nothing, and the Archduke Ferdinand covers himself in shame. You abandon Vienna, you no longer protect it. Comme c'est vous disiez. God is with us, God help you in your capital. There was one general we all liked, Schmidt. You put him in the path of a bullet, and congratulate us with your victory. You must agree that to think up a more exasperating news than what you've brought would be impossible. C'est comme on fait express, comme on fait express. Besides that, well, if you were to gain a truly brilliant victory, if the Archduke Karl were even to gain a victory, what would it change in the general course of affairs? It's too late now, since Vienna is occupied by French troops. Occupied? Vienna occupied? Not only occupied, but Bonaparte is in Schönbrunn, and the court, our dear Count Verbanna, is going to him for orders. After the fatigues and impressions of the journey, the reception, and especially after dinner, Volokhonsky felt that he did not quite understand the full significance of the words he had heard. This morning, Count Lichtenfels was here, Bilibin went on, and he showed me a letter which described in detail the parade of the French in Vienna. Le prince mourra et tout le tremblement. You see that your victory doesn't bring much joy, and that you can't be received as a savior. Really, it's all the same to me, all quite the same, said Prince Andrei, beginning to realize that his news about the battle at Krems was indeed of little importance in the view of such events as the occupation of the capital of Austria. How is that Vienna's been taken? What about the bridge, and the famous Tête de Pont, and Prince Augsburg? There was a rumor among us that the Prince Augsburg was defending Vienna, he said. Prince Augsburg is standing there on this side, our side, defending us. I suppose he's defending us very poorly, but he's still defending us. But Vienna is on the other side. No, the bridge has not yet been taken, and I hope will not be taken, because it's mined and there's an order to blow it up. Otherwise, we'd have been in the mountains of Bohemia long ago, and you and your army would have spent a bad quarter of an hour between two fires. That still doesn't mean the campaign is over, said Prince Andrei. But I think it's over, and the big wigs here think so too, though they don't dare say it. It will turn out, as I said at the beginning of the campaign, that the matter won't be decided by your échafaud de Dürrenstein, nor by gunpowder, but by those who invented gunpowder, said Bilibin, repeating one of his mots, releasing the skin of his forehead and pausing. The only question is what the meeting in Berlin between the Emperor Alexander and the King of Prussia will tell us. If Prussia enters the alliance, on forcera la main à l'Autriche, and there will be war. If not, it will only be a matter of arranging where to draw up the preliminary articles for a new Campo Formio. But what an extraordinary genius, Prince Andrei cried suddenly, clenching his small fist and pounding it on the table. What luck the man has! Bonaparte? Bilibin said questioningly, wrinkling his forehead with that letting it be felt that a molt was coming. Bonaparte, he said, with especial emphasis on the U. I think, however, that now that he's prescribing laws for Austria and Schönbrunn, il fait offert grâce le U. I decidedly make an innovation and call him Bonaparte tout court. No, joking aside, said Prince Andrei, do you really think the campaign is over? Here's what I think. Austria's been played for a fool, and she's not used to it, and she'll pay it back. She's been played for a fool because, first, the provinces are devastated. On dit l'Orthodox army est terrible pour le pillage. Her army is destroyed, and her capital has been taken, and all that pour le but de His Sardinian Majesty. And therefore, entre nous, mon cher, I feel instinctively that we're being deceived. I feel instinctively that communications with France and plans for peace, a secret peace, are being concluded separately. That can't be, said Prince Andrei. It would be too vile. Que vivra vera, said Bilibin, again releasing his skin as a sign that the conversation was over. When Prince Andrei went to the room prepared for him and lay down on the feather bed and fragrant warmed-up pillows and clean linen, he felt that the battle, the news of which he had brought, was far, far away from him. The Prussian alliance, the treachery of Austria, the new triumph of Bonaparte, the levee and the parade, and his reception by the Emperor Franz the next day preoccupied him. He closed his eyes, but at the same instant in his ears there crackled a cannonade, gunfire, the rattle of carriage wheels, and now again the stretched-out line of musketeers goes down the hill, and the French are shooting, and he feels his heart thrill, and he is riding in front next to Schmidt, and the bullets are whistling merrily about him, and he experiences that feeling of the tenfold joy of life, such as he has not experienced since childhood. He woke up. Yes, all that happened, he said, smiling happily to himself like a child, and he fell into a sound, youthful sleep. And that's the end of 10. So we'll give it a stop there for today. Rather interesting. Makes me wonder, what is it about men that really love war? It's very interesting. Maybe it's that feeling of purpose that he seems to like so relish in. It's very interesting. It's reminding me I probably should brush up on my European history because I don't remember all the nuances and the intrigues of Bonaparte and the different courts. So, yeah. Well, feel free to drop any comments in the chat, any thoughts and queries, and we will continue again tomorrow. Tomorrow's Friday, so it'll be the last reading of the week, and see how far we'll get. Some interesting action here today between the various things. I was a little worried there that young Nikolai Rostov was going to get shot. So funny. He's like such a young man and so preoccupied with the, what he feels are the grievances that are surrounding him, even in the middle of a battle. But I guess we all get preoccupied that way, don't we? So, all right. Thank you. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you very much. You guys have a great rest of your day. And again, we will pick up tomorrow at 3. Thanks so much. Bye.